she came into the hospital initially as a adolescent, and right away was grabbed onto, was held there against her will for long periods of time, was in restraints for 6 months at a time.
Oh my God.
It's just like out of the snake pit. There's this horrible story, in seclusion, naked for days on end, naked in 4-point restraints.
Life, wisdom. So you are publishing a new book about CIA mind control. Can you tell us a little bit about this book?
Sure. So I've published books through like regular publishers in New York and Toronto and so on, but I also have my own small publishing company, and I've mostly in the past published books by me.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a little bit different venture. This is a book called Surviving Evil. The subtitle is CIA Mind Control Experiments in Vermont, and the author is a woman named Karen Wetmore. Okay. And this book should physically be out late March, early April. It's almost ready to be printed.
Wow.
And it's basically, she contacted me over a decade ago, and we've been corresponding back and forth, and she's been sending me documents. And it started out with her concern that she was a victim of CIA mind control experiments, which is certainly possible because many people have been. But what she did that's unique, and all the people who've ever contacted me, is she filed all these Freedom of Information Act requests, read all this background literature, got all these documents and pieced it all together. And the center of it is, in her actual medical record that I have a copy of, is the name of one of the doctors at the Vermont State Hospital when she was there as a late adolescent, young adult. And that's Dr. Robert W. Hyde, who's documented to be a top secret cleared MKUltra contractor on CIA LSD experiments. So we know for a fact that a CIA doctor is in her medical record, was on site. And this Dr. Hyde was the director of research at Vermont State Hospital for many years. Wow. And then what she's built up is this whole network of, okay, so Dr. Hyde, this doctor, this doctor, this doctor, this doctor who are at Vermont State Hospital are connected to this doctor and this doctor and this doctor by publishing papers together, attending conferences together. And she's able to show this whole network of doctors who are all involved in military mind control in one way or another.
Wow.
And she's able to document very conclusively that, which I knew independently already, that this man named John Gittinger was the head of the psychology section for MKUltra, basically. And he developed this thing called the personality assessment system that the CIA put a lot of money into. So I was already aware of that, but Karen has documented that that system was used pervasively in Vermont State Hospital and related hospitals. There's a whole giant computer project set up to manage the data, and the data was sent back to CIA buildings in Washington, where John Gittinger was working, where his professional company was. And people who worked at that location with Gittinger directly also were on site at Vermont. And then all kinds of connections between Vermont and McGill, which is not that far away, where Ewan Cameron was an MKUltra contractor. So there's this huge network of connections and relationships.
Wow.
And then she's been able to document that she was given a variety of different drugs which were used in mind control experimentation, that she came into the hospital initially as a adolescent, and right away was grabbed onto, was held there against her will for long periods of time, was in restraints for 6 months at a time.
Oh my God.
It's just like out of the snake pit. There's this horrible story, in seclusion, naked for days on end, naked in 4-point restraints. Not quite 100% proven, but totally convincing to me, sexually abused by one of the psychiatrists, virtually for sure. And then she's able to document how mail that she was sending to different senators was intercepted, and even the post office it was intercepted at. Wow. Certified mail disappearing. So it's a whole story that's extremely well documented. And in the middle of this, as a child, she developed multiple personalities because of trauma that happened before she was at the hospital. At one period, I forget the exact duration of time, it's like 6 or 9 months. She went by a completely different name. All the nurses called her by that name. And then she flipped back to her usual self and didn't remember that admission. So there's a lot of details like that in the documents. There's documentation of her being dissociative, having hysterical dissociative symptoms, having amnesia. There's what's called a metrazole enhanced EEG, which I have separate documents from Bluebird Artichoke, where metrazole was used as an interrogation torture technique. And it was previously used before ECT, electric shock, came on. It was used to induce seizures as kind of a chemical form of electroconvulsive therapy. And she was given that, and her EEG was monitored at the same time. So there's all these details she's built up. And in the midst of all that, just a very, very vividly told story that's just as a story to read. It's incredibly compelling. It draws you in. And all the outrageous stuff that happened to her, all the tragedies she went through inside the hospital and out. And then this amazing survival where she's been integrated, hasn't had multiple personalities since the late 90s.
Wow. So she's experienced, you could say, a recovery from all of
amazing these. Story of triumph and recovery.
Wow.
And her therapist, I've met with her and her therapist. I wasn't involved in her treatment in any way at all. And her therapist makes a comment on the back cover of the book. So it's all confirmed and validated by the records and by the therapist.
Wow. That's incredible.
And so to me, it's one of the most amazing personal stories of trauma, abuse, and recovery before we even add on the CIA mind control experimentation angle. And one of the things that's the most alarming, which I can't prove at all, is the possibility that some of these patients at Vermont were used in terminal experiments. Because what we do have, which is in the books, is a list for spanning 20 years of the number of patients who died in that hospital every year. And it went way up during the period of CIA funding and immediately dropped way down when the CIA funding stopped. So I put that on the back cover because this really, really, really needs to be investigated.
Yeah, I mean, this certainly would, raise enough concern that it's worth a deeper look.
So for an absolute fact, there was CIA mind control experimentation money in Vermont State Hospital. Absolutely documented, 100% for sure. There was a doctor who's a documented MKUltra contractor, and there's numerous other connected in doctors. That's all locked down, proven. Wow. So this is not, a fanciful leap. And in the CIA documents that I have separately, there's a discussion of the problem of disposal of subjects.
And you've talked about this before in previous videos.
And so the idea that there could have been terminal experiments done there in Vermont, which is kind of hidden away, which is within easy driving distance of McGill, where horrible MKUltra experiments were done. Very plausible, very believable.
Wow.
And there's been cover up, closed doors in her face for decades as she's trying to get to the truth of this.
Right. And I know that in the previous videos where we've discussed in depth your research that you have done, you yourself received, 15,000 pages of documents from your Freedom of Information Act request regarding the CIA mind control experiments. So, certainly it would be more pleasant to say, oh, that's a bunch of phooey, that just didn't happen. But unfortunately, the proof is now there. The documentation has now been released showing that, no, yes, indeed, these experiments really were taking place. They were taking place in major universities, and they were taking place with taxpayer money. I mean, it's government money that was going into, you've described some atrocious experiments here in these interviews with me. So I think it's really interesting that now here, Karen is in the situation where, as a victim of this abuse, she's actually gone out personally to make these Freedom of Information Act requests and to write this book really recounting her journey through, like as you said, having all these closed doors slammed in her face. Clearly this was not an easy book to put together. Can you talk a little bit more about maybe how doing all of this research, publishing this book has affected her and has maybe been a part of her recovery?
Well, she didn't have multiple personality anymore by the time she first contacted me.
Okay.
So it's not tied into her multiple personality. It's her as a human being.
Okay.
And I think it's been, first of all, I'm so tremendously impressed by just surviving, period. Mm-hmm. And then actively investigating all of this, documenting it, putting it together, cross-checking it, then actually writing, and then having the guts to have the book published, not being overwhelmed with paranoia. The whole process has been incredibly validating and helpful for her as a human being, not for mental health as such, just her as a human being.
Mm-hmm. The message I want to come across in this video is that there is hope for people who have been victims of this type of abuse, whether
Absolutely.
It was, the CIA mind control experiments specifically, or whether it's just trauma in general, these different traumatic events, that there is a hope for recovery. And that kind of at the crux of that is figuring out what really happened, talking about what really happened, and the therapy. You mentioned that you weren't her therapist, but that she was, it was therapy that helped her to overcome and overcome those multiple personalities.
Exactly. And so she's a shining example of recovery from amazing trauma and adversity is absolutely realistically possible. Mm-hmm. And it takes a lot of work.
Right. Certainly I'm grateful that we now have this book, or we will shortly have this book documenting these things, because CIA mind control is something that people just brush aside. Oh, that's not real. That's a crazy conspiracy theory. But after doing these interviews with you, I know that that's not true. This is something that happened. It's documented.
We know what happened to Karen Wetmore. Mm-hmm. And I just think that she's, as I said, provided this wonderful example of how you can triumph over really big time betrayal, abuse, and adversity and tragedy.
Certainly. And are there any resources or places you would direct people to go if maybe they themselves think that they might have been a victim either of, CIA mind control, for instance, or really any kind of, significant trauma where you might direct them
I always give the same advice, which is try and find a good, solid, skilled therapist who understands trauma, who has good boundaries and good ethics. Mm-hmm. That's my number one piece of advice.
All right. And maybe to not lose hope, on an ending note here, to never lose hope. Well, thank you so much for your time here today.
Well, thank you.
And thank you so much for watching. I do hope that you have enjoyed this video. Please be sure to subscribe to the Psyche Truth channel so you can see all of our future videos. I'm Psyche Truth correspondent Karina Rachel. Thank you for watching.